Welcome to a video edition of the Bioethics Podcast, a project of the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity at Trinity International University. My name is Matthew Epinette, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center. In this episode of the podcast, we have Dr. Gilbert Meilaender's presentation of the Kilner Bioethics Lectureship from March of this year. His talk encourages us to consider how we best view children, as gifts to be received or as projects to be undertaken, and what each view conveys about our own humanity. Since we have video of the lecture, we decided to make this our first video podcast. Of course, you can listen to it as an audio-only podcast, but for those who would like to see the lecture, this is an option for this lecture. Before we get to the lecture, I want to ask you for a small favor. Would you go ahead and mark your calendar to save the date for next year's conference, June 27 through 29, 2024. The title of the conference is The Future of Health, Faith, Ethics, and Our MedTech World, and it comes from seeing the ways in which technology of all sorts continue to change our lives and our world. In my talk at this year's conference, I highlighted ways in which artificial intelligence and genetic engineering or editing through the technology known as CRISPR are already changing healthcare. As these and other technologies continue to develop and advance, what will the concept of health come to mean? How will we think about what it means to be healthy? How will technologies like this affect and change the practice of medicine and medical education? How does our Christian faith inform what we consider to be healthy and what options we'll pursue or avoid in the quest for health? That's June 27 through 29, 2024. The Future of Health, Faith, Ethics, and Our MedTech World, June 27 through 29. And now for Dr. Meilaender's presentation of the 2023 John F. Kilner Bioethics Lectureship. Dr. Gilbert Meilaender is a senior research professor at Valparaiso University and the Paul Ramsey Fellow at the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. He taught at the University of Virginia, at Oberlin College, and at Valparaiso University, where he held the Duesenberg Chair in Christian Ethics. He's a fellow of the Hastings Center and was a member of the President's Council on Bioethics from 2002 to 2009. He's published numerous articles and books on topics in theological ethics, Christian bioethics, and the Christian life. And here's Dr. Meilaender on the meaning of children, competing narratives.
Thank you, Michael. Let me say at the outset, if it turns out that I'm not speaking loud enough, you just got to wave your hand up there, and I might or might not respond. It's a little. I find this a little eerie, seeing myself on this screen over here. I'm just not quite sure what to make of that experience, but anyway, I'm pleased to be here. And I'm in particular pleased to be given the opportunity to speak in this lecture series that was established to honor the work of John Kilner, a work which includes his own scholarly writing, his service as an editor, bringing together the writings of others, and his efforts to help build here at Trinity a center where bioethics is done in ways that are shaped by Christian belief, which means that it is, if not unique, at least rather distinctive in the world of academic bioethics. And I think and hope that the topic that I am taking up this evening is one that has in fact been important in John's own thinking. So it won't come as a surprise to him. I think I need to give you one warning at the start. Warning up, this won't become important until fairly near the end of the talk. But you have invited a Lutheran to speak tonight. Lutherans have a rather higher view of some of the sacraments than some of you perhaps do, and you'll just have to deal with that when the time comes. But it'll take us a long time to get there, so you can relax for quite a long time. What I want to think with you about tonight might be broadly described just as the relation between parents and children. Also, in some respects, the meaning of sex and marriage. But you don't need me to tell you that these are subjects that it's hard to talk about today. We have no real shared script, no shared understanding in our culture of these matters, even though, of course, we know that in some way they are important for human life. And of course, to be sure, many people would agree that wholly apart from any particular religious beliefs, marriage does serve some important purposes in human society. It gives us a way of dealing with the fact of sexual difference between men and women, especially including the vulnerabilities that women may experience in pregnancy and childbirth. It creates a form of life that holds together sexual attraction, personal commitment, childcare, and mutual economic and psychological assistance. And it provides a social context for the rearing of children, maintaining connection between children and their parents, and even larger intergenerational ties. Those are all important matters. We'd be hard pressed to get along without some way of dealing with them, even if it sometimes seems that our society is going to try to do just that these days. But all of that we could talk about just in terms of social and political well-being. There's nothing inherently theological about it. And I'm afraid that sometimes when we do decide we need to talk theologically about it, we lapse all too easily into sort of vague ways of speaking, talking about love in a kind of formless way, for instance, ways that don't actually help all that much. And whenever that happens, I often think of a story that G.K. Chesterton tells in his autobiography. He's talking about some of the intelligentsia of his day, though Chesterton didn't actually think that they were all that intelligent. But he mentions one man for whom he had a great deal of respect, who he thought was insightful, a man named Edgar Jepson, whom we no longer kind of remember any longer today. But then Chesterton recalls a conversation in which Jepson had been involved, but also another man, a man who had the tendency, or the habit of, when he wanted to say something, which he thought profound, would hold up his hand and he would say a thought. And then he'd say, whatever it was. And one time in one of these conversations, this other man held up his hand and said, a thought. All we need is love. And Chesterton said Jepson just couldn't take it any longer. And so he just sort of exploded and he said, good God, man, you don't call that a thought, do you? That in some ways is sort of the burden of what I want to say today. If we want to think as Christians about marriage, parents, and children, we have to do a little more than just have sort of a thought about love. And that's what I hope to do, at least tonight. In the last half century or so, we have experienced what might be called a revolution in reproduction. We are likely to describe it as a technological revolution, and it is that in many ways. But perhaps, at least as importantly, it is a revolution in our way of thinking about the relation between parents and children. And it may not always be easy to say which came first, changed thinking or changed technology. But however exactly we tell this story, a commitment to the use of technologies of assisted reproduction is increasingly well established in our society and in many other societies in the world. And whether we make use of these technologies or not, turn your face steadfastly against them. Doesn't matter. It will still be true that even if we decide not to use them, we have to decide. We have to think about them in a way that earlier generations would not have, and that makes a tremendous difference. Moreover, the goodness of such technologies, at least in my experience, is often taken for granted and even commended by many Christians. And we have to ask ourselves, is that commendation grounded in important Christian commitments, or may it rather be grounded in feelings and emotions that seem to come naturally to us, but may sometimes not amount to much more than a thought? We can think first of where we are today, where this technological revolution has brought us, and then get around to trying to put it into a larger theological context. But I want to take some time first just to trace the course of this technological progress over the last 50 years. And it actually occurred to me, I'd already thought of what I wanted to talk about, but it occurred to me when I was putting this together that this was a rather sort of striking thought for me. I'm actually considering the story of my professional life. I've been thinking about these topics for 50 years or so, and that's about how long this has been going on. I didn't think I was that old, but this last half century has been a time in which extraordinary change has taken place. And so I wanted to sort of first kind of trace that story in some detail. Artificial insemination, of course, has been used for a long time in animal breeding, and its use even among human beings is at least a century old. But the more far-reaching technological breakthrough came with the procedure of in vitro fertilization, in which sperm and ova are externalized and then joined in the laboratory where fertilization takes place. And the resulting embryo, or more likely embryos, can then be transferred to a woman's uterus in the hope of achieving a pregnancy. The first child known to have been produced by means of IVF, who was called at that time in a sort of a quaint formulation, the first test tube baby. I can remember ourselves talking about that. That child was born in 1978, about the time I started paying attention to these things. Now, however, approximately 4.5 decades later, it's estimated that more than 400,000 children are born worldwide each year from IVF. IVF was first developed in order to assist married couples struggling with infertility. And when we think of that as its purpose, we may quite easily assume that it must be good and praiseworthy, because whatever one's reservations about the use of this technology for reproductive purposes, sympathy for infertile couples comes quite naturally to us. This may be true especially for many Christians. Accustomed as we are to thinking of children as, in the psalmist's terms, a heritage of the Lord, and sympathetic as we are to the natural desire to have a child of one's own, we may be reluctant to raise questions or concerns about the use of IVF. Surely, however, the technology has now developed and will continue to develop in such far-reaching ways that to think of it simply as help for infertile couples is pretty much to miss the point of what's become of this development. In fact, in the minds of many people, it has relatively little connection to the institution of marriage, that is, to the desire of a husband and wife to see their marriage express itself in a child who incarnates their one flesh union. Rather, it is about individual desire to experience a certain kind of fulfillment. Read maybe the most widely read book on the subject in the last 20 years, John Robertson's Children of Choice, and that's exactly it's an individual desire for a certain kind of fulfillment that's crucial, or he thinks crucial, to human beings. We need, therefore, to ask ourselves whether our understanding of the meaning of the presence of children is being formed by basic Christian belief that a child is God's gift to those who are married, or whether our attitudes and actions increasingly reflect a belief that what counts is satisfying the desire to have a child of one's own, and perhaps even a particular kind of child. We need to ask ourselves whether the gift of a child is grounded in the mutual bodily self-giving of husband and wife, or whether its ground is human choice and determination. IVF can and often does involve much more than simply taking sperm from a man and an ovum from his wife, uniting them in the laboratory, and then transferring the resulting embryo to the woman's uterus. IVF can also be a way to produce children free of certain defects, or children of a desired sex. A couple or an individual desiring children may commission others to fill some of the necessary roles in reproduction. So the sperm or ova or both may come from, not from the commissioning parents, but from people whom we call donors, though in fact they are often vendors who have sold their gametes. The embryos produced in the laboratory, whether from one's own or donated gametes, may be transferred not to the woman who has commissioned the reproductive project, but to another woman who serves as a surrogate, agreeing to gestate the child and then give it after birth to the couple or the individual desiring child. Because more embryos may be produced in the laboratory than can be safely transferred to a woman's uterus, the commissioning couple may decide to freeze the remaining embryos that they don't need at least at that time. They may use them at a later date to try again to conceive a child, or they may never use them, leaving the embryos frozen indefinitely or discarded or perhaps made available for use in research. We should, however, train ourselves, whatever we think of the process, we should train ourselves to call such embryos unimplanted embryos. They're usually called, if you read the literature, listen to people, they're called pre-implantation embryos, as if we're just an accident of nature that they were sort of floating around in this pre-implantation state. They're not that. They're unimplanted embryos, and we should call them that to remind ourselves that it's a condition that we have willed and chosen. It's not just an accident of nature. Such frozen, unimplanted embryos now number in the hundreds of thousands, even in millions. And our society seems willing to permit that number to grow, continue to grow indefinitely. Many of these frozen embryos will never be needed or wanted by those who produce them in an effort to achieve a pregnancy. What then is to be done with them? There is no satisfactory answer to that question. I just want to repeat that sentence. Say, what's to be done with these frozen embryos? No longer wanted by the people who produce them? There is no satisfactory answer to that question. As long as we permit and even encourage freezing of embryos, we create for ourselves a moral problem for which there is no good solution. Leaving embryos frozen indefinitely seems unsatisfactory, but using them for research, which will inevitably involve their destruction, would be wrong. They have already been used once as a means to someone else's reproductive project, and being used once is probably enough. My own personal preference, not all of you will agree with it, probably. I said there is no good solution to this. I would thaw them and let them die. I would do it in the context of some kind of liturgical setting, devised precisely for that. You're probably not going to see that solution catch on across society, but that seems to me to be the best we can do in the circumstances that we have ourselves created. One proposed solution, though, to the problem of surplus frozen embryos, a solution that has been attractive to some, maybe to many Christians, has been called embryo adoption. This means simply that a woman, and generally her husband, make use of IVF technology to gestate someone else's frozen and now unwanted embryo, hoping to bring that child to term and to raise it as their own. There was a really striking instance of this in the news. It's within, I think, maybe the last year or so, in which an embryo that had been frozen for 30 years, 3 decades, was implanted, gestated, and brought to term by a couple who thought that what they were doing was a kind of work of Christian charity, and I'm sure in their minds it was. No doubt those who do this are often moved by several different considerations, both desiring to become parents and wanting to offer the possibility of continued life to an abandoned embryo. For some, it may also be a way to deal with infertility. And although, at least in my view, we cannot say that such embryo adoption is wrong. I would not say that. I think that we can hardly recommend it when we remind ourselves of the millions of orphaned and abandoned children in the world who need a familial home. If we are searching for children in need of adoption, children who lack a family committed to their well-being, children who are likely to suffer continued harm and probably cause continued harm unless they find such a family, these children are all around us in our society. If we have the resources and ability to adopt, it seems better for us to direct that energy toward children who already born, who need a place of familial belonging. More recently and increasingly, young single women have been using IVF technology to take a yet further step by freezing their unfertilized eggs, not freezing embryos, but freezing unfertilized eggs. And they do this not because they necessarily experience fertility problems, but as a kind of insurance against future reproductive problems, or simply in order to have time to pursue other goals before committing to marriage and parenthood. Closely connected to the practice of IVF is the use of genetic testing. Indeed, it's almost impossible to imagine IVF being used as it's used in our society without genetic testing. And our society has now come, I think, to consider genetic testing of fetuses in utero as almost routine. Indeed, if a pregnant woman doesn't want to test the fetus she's carrying, she's probably going to have to fight for that right. In fact, not to do that. Amniocentesis was available already in the 1950s. Chorionic villus sampling, which takes tissue from the placenta in the 1980s. And still more recently, what's called non-invasive prenatal testing, which can isolate fetal DNA in blood drawn from the mother, can be done fairly early in the first trimester of pregnancy. And at least in principle, were it to become a little more affordable than it is right now, it could enable the entire genome of a fetus in utero to be sequenced. It's also, we might note, been an extraordinarily profitable undertaking in the world. Now, of course, when we think about genetic testing, at least at the present time, there is no treatment available for most of the conditions that might be detected while the fetus is in utero from prenatal screening. The only treatment that can avoid the birth of a child with genetic defects or disabilities is abortion, which eliminates the suffering by eliminating the sufferer. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is done before there is ever an implanted embryo. Genetic testing in the laboratory of the unimplanted embryo moves the testing process back still further, prior even to the establishment of a pregnancy. And it's now possible to identify in an unimplanted embryo hundreds of disease mutations as well as its chromosomal makeup. This allows the commissioning parent or parents to select only some of the embryos for implantation, avoiding in particular any that may have genetic defects and perhaps any that may be of the undesired sex. In principle, therefore, it is now possible for a child to be born with as many as 5 people who we might in some sense call parents. The donors of sperm and ova, a surrogate who gestates a child during pregnancy, and the 2 commissioning parents who undertake to raise that child at some point in the future. So that we stand on the brink of a world, in fact, we're already in it in some ways, in which we will hardly know how to name some of the relationships that are produced by this technological change. So a woman can give birth to what we might, in a way, call her own grandchild by gestating a fetus produced in a laboratory with gametes taken from her child and his or her spouse. And she gestates that fetus. It's a sense in which it's her grandchild she gives birth to. People can have children posthumously if their frozen embryos are implanted and gestated in someone else after their death. And there are certainly instances in which people have, parents of someone who died already have wanted precisely that to be done. A woman lacking ovaries can receive an ovary transplant from an aborted fetus, in which case that fetus could become the genetic child of a mother born to that woman. By means of eggs made in the laboratory from induced pluripotent stem cells, it may soon be possible to avoid the costly and medically burdensome process of retrieving eggs from women. And given that sperm are pretty readily available, this would mean that an individual or a couple could produce many embryos, almost an indefinite number of embryos from which to choose after testing. Perhaps even, it's a little too soon to say for certain, though you should never bet against science in a way. Perhaps even researchers may be able to use induced pluripotent stem cells to make sperm from a woman's cells or ova from a man's cells, meaning that a child could be produced using sperm and egg derived from the cells of the same parent, single parent, the child. In fact, just in the last, I think it's just the last week, or maybe it's the last 2 weeks, there was a story that you may have seen, scientists in Japan who produced mice with 2 biological fathers, no mother involved. First, they took male skin cells from the mouse and reprogrammed them to produce induced pluripotent stem cells. And second, they deleted the Y chromosome from those cells. And then they took an X chromosome from another cell of the body and used it to replace that deleted Y chromosome, thereby producing induced pluripotent cells that had two identical X chromosomes, an egg produced solely from male cells. They fertilized those eggs with normal mice sperm, and they obtained 600 mouse embryos, which they then implanted in surrogate mice. And from those 600, they had 7 live births. That's not a huge success rate, of course. But as I said, if you bet against science, you're just you're using up your retirement income. I think those 7 mice that they had did appear healthy, according to the reports. They had a normal lifespan, and they went on to produce offspring as adults. The researchers granted that it would be more complicated to do this with human cells, mainly because the gestation period for human beings is so much longer that a lot of things could go wrong in the process. But when they said that it would be less likely, they said things like, the one researcher is quoted saying, it couldn't happen right away, probably be 10 years. I don't know how you react to 10 years, but I don't think it was a terribly long period of time. One said 10 to 20 years. But that's where we're headed. So that if you consider the possibility of such a child produced with cells entirely, sperm and egg entirely derived from a male, it's not impossible to imagine that has already been done with a lamb. A child could be gestated entirely in an artificial womb, thereby, without any bodily connection of child to a mother, achieving, in fact, what Aldous Huxley only imagined in Brave New World. But this is not at all impossible in the relatively near future, which many of you will see. I don't actually expect to see it, but that's because I eat a lot of French fries. At any rate, that's the story of what we've done. This is the story of what we have accomplished in the last half century or so. Not a very long time in world historical terms. But what I want to do now is sort of turn from this the story of what we've done to try to place this story into sort of larger narrative settings, to move from just the facts of it to sort of understanding what it is we're doing. And we can ask ourselves, into what larger story shall we place these developments in order to try to think more carefully about them and their implications? And I want to sketch 2 competing narratives for what I will call, in one case, procreation, very old term, and in the other, reproduction, which is more or less what we're doing today. And I want to kind of sketch these out and think about their implications, their theological implications a little bit. Clearly, I think 2 quite different and competing ways of understanding the bond between parents and children are at work in our society. We tell different stories where we're shaped by different stories about this most basic of human relationships. And it's just worth considering how they differ and the implications of each. One story, deeply embedded in Christian teaching and belief, which is not to say that all Christians today are formed by it, but a story deeply embedded in Christian belief, understands the child as a blessing that is given to a man and a woman. The man and woman have given themselves in love to each other, and the child given to them is a blessing upon that self-giving of theirs, aiming to express their love for each other as fully and completely as they can. They sometimes find, not always, but they sometimes find that in the providence of God, their love-giving has also been life-giving. They weren't necessarily trying to produce that, but God produced it. Then they receive the child not simply as a product of their aims and intentions, not something that they were aiming at, but as a gift and a mystery springing from their embrace, a blessing given to them. And they might well try to say of that what the biblical writer says of Hannah after the birth of Samuel: the Lord remembered her. This way of thinking, as I said, has been embedded deeply in our culture, so deeply that it can appear in ways that have no obvious religious roots at all, but it's deep into our culture. And I want to illustrate that for you by reading a poem. It's hard to listen to somebody read a poem, but I really like this poem, and it's my talk, so I'm going to read it. Some of you may know the poem. It's by Galway Kinnell, who I believe is no longer living. I'm not sure about that. It's a poem titled "After Making Love, We Hear Footsteps." For I can snore like a bullhorn or play loud music or sit up talking with any reasonably sober Irishman, and Fergus will only sink deeper into his dreamless sleep, which goes by all in one flash. But let there be that heavy breathing or a stifled cum cry anywhere in the house, and he will wrench himself awake and make for it on the run, as now we lie together after making love, quiet, touching along the length of our bodies, familiar touch to the long married, and he appears in his baseball pajamas, it happens, the neck opening so small he has to screw them on, which one day may make him wonder about the mental capacity of baseball players, and flops down between us and hugs us and snuggles himself to sleep, his face gleaming with satisfaction at being this very child. In the half darkness, we look at each other and smile and touch arms across his little startlingly muscled body, this one whom habit of memory propels to the ground of his making, sleeper only the mortal sounds can sing awake, this blessing love gives again into our arms. And it's striking how theological content appears at the end of a poem. There's not in any particular way theological, but that content that appears works to describe what it is that the habit of memory that propels little Fergus to the ground of his making. That sort of understanding of procreation shaped Christian thinking about parents and children. And in fact, when taken seriously, it can provide young men and women in our society something that they are largely lacking and desperately need, a kind of cultural script that will help them understand better both their individual identities and their relation to each other. They can learn to see their relation not merely as a matter for choice and pursuing projects, but as entry into a pattern for life given by God. They can learn that the erotic desire that they experience for each other is also a desire to give birth, to turn outward as a couple. They can learn to think of the body not simply as an instrument used by a person to produce desired outcomes, but rather as the very place in which we are personally present to others in friendship and in love. The body is not just a thing that we use to produce it, but where we are personally present. Moreover, this script that they might enact or could enact is not just a natural fact. It's built into the natural world, but it has its basis in the mystery of God's own creative work. The opening chapter of the Gospel of John is clear that our world was created in and through Jesus, the one who is God's word of love to humanity. So also our own procreation, growing out of the giving and receiving of love between a man and a woman, can image the mystery of God's creative work. That's the kind of cultural narrative that I think has been embedded in our culture through Christian belief. And I think, and I hope that it's more than just sort of a thought about love. I think it's deeper than that. There's another competing story, a story that is becoming increasingly influential in our world. And according to that story, parents are people who undertake what we might call a reproductive project. The purpose of the project is to produce a child of their own, that is, one who satisfies their desire for a child to rear, a desire that they feel must be satisfied if their lives are to be fulfilling or incomplete. This may be a project undertaken by two people who are married, but it doesn't have to be. It can be undertaken by various other people who are not married and who may have no interest, in fact, in being married, but who, for one reason or another, want a child to rear or children to rear. And so if for one reason or another, they are unable to produce a child of their own through sexual intercourse or unwilling to produce a child of their own through sexual intercourse, they can have recourse to technological means of assisted reproduction to accomplish that goal. And they can, if they need to, hire others to assist in that project, even perhaps hire a woman as a surrogate to use her body as an instrument to gestate the child. Indeed, I saw again only quite recently, not the last week or so, but pretty recently, an article arguing or suggesting that what we might do is use women who are brain dead but still sustain on ventilators to gestate children to birth, using their bodies as a kind of incubator to accomplish that goal, which is sort of about as far as you can imagine in the instrumentalization of the body. Now, just in terms of the kind of language that ethicists use, if we think only in terms of results of our action, if that's what we think about, the results of what we do, then we may suppose that the people who do this, in one way or another, undertake a reproductive project of this sort, have simply found another way of doing the same thing that others do through ordinary procreation. Namely, they found a way to have a child. In fact, however, although a child may result from both sexual intercourse and various forms of assisted reproduction, the result may be the same in that way. These are not simply different ways of doing the same thing. It's better read your Aristotle about doing and making and so forth, and see that there's something different going on here. In the first of these, in what we've called traditionally procreation, spouses align themselves with God's act of creative love. That's the narrative in which they understand what they're undertaking. They do not suppose that the person exists simply apart from the body and just uses the body to accomplish various desired results. Rather, they simply give themselves to each other in love, not just in spirit, but also in body. And then sometimes God blesses such mutual love with the gift of a child, with little Fergus, who comes along. But in the other narrative, what they do is they undertake a project seeking to produce a child who will meet their desires, whatever exactly those desires may happen to be, and they use the means necessary to accomplish that goal. So we have two stories marked by different ways of thinking about our bodies, our personal presence in the body, or use of the body, and our children. Is the body the place of personal presence in which we give ourselves in love, or is the body an instrument we use to accomplish our goals? Is the child a product of our will and choosing, one whom we have made, or is the child one who is begotten, springing from the mutual love and therefore our equal in dignity? When we use our bodies as instruments for reproduction, as people in our culture have increasingly come to think of themselves as doing, and indeed as we encourage them in many respects to do, then we learn to think of ourselves less as the embodied creatures God has made and more as free spirits detached from the body and free to use it as an object for achieving whatever purposes we happen to think good and desirable. Then it's not hard to think of the desired child as a product we have made, and quite possibly made to meet certain specifications. Moreover, we may then have no reason to refrain from using gametes acquired from third parties, or refrain from hiring a surrogate to gestate the desired child. Those may, after all, simply be among the necessary means of production. That's what they are in that narrative. And indeed, Christian women have sometimes been eager to serve as surrogates, thinking of their fertility simply as a capacity that they can give as a gift to others. But compassion for those who are infertile then becomes a kind of formless emotion. It's love. It's a thought about love, no longer taking its shape from God's own creative work. For if we have come to think of ourselves as free spirits who may choose to use the body for whatever good purposes we have in mind, it may be that something has gone awry. It may be that our churches have failed to teach us how rightly to honor our creation as embodied persons. At any rate, God so structures human life that marital love serves both to strengthen the bond between spouses and sometimes to give rise to the next generation. We might say that both the love-giving and the life-giving dimensions of marriage, in both the love-giving and the life-giving dimensions of marriage, the most basic gift God gives to a husband and wife is the gift of time. That, at least, is the way that I like to think of it, a shared time. They're given time to learn what fidelity in love means, Time for each to learn to care for another who is as different from them as their bodies are different. And that is a task that requires time, actually. Time to shape a future together. Time for their union to give rise by God's providence to the next generation. Time for their union to turn outward in various other shared ways as well. Time, it's that shared time that God gives. The companionship of marriage, therefore, is much more than a series of isolated sexual acts. It is a shared history within the time that God gives us. And likewise, when we think of the gift of children, we should see them within the context of that gift of time, not as the result or the fruit of isolated sexual acts, as if marriage were a series of one-night stands, but of marriage as a whole. Hence, although contraception may be misused, it can also be rightly used. When husband and wife seek to shape their time together in response to God's calling, the shared history of each married couple, the time that God gives them, will have its own particular shape, with children differently spaced and in different numbers in ways that are appropriate to their time, their particular and peculiar time together. Each married couple will need to attend to the shape of that married life. There's no one shape that fits all. We can only say that their shared time should be marked by a companionship that is faithful for the whole of life, a companionship that turns outward to the world, usually, though not necessarily, in the child, perhaps through the gift of an adopted child. It may turn outward, or perhaps in other ways. It takes more work, but it can be done. But then, in the context of that Christian narrative, I want to ask what we say finally about the problem of infertility. What if no blessing is given into our arms? There's no little Fergus who comes creating havoc along the way. When married couples who hope for children experience infertility, it is natural that they should feel sadness. For, as I said before, erotic love naturally desires to give birth. It's natural for them to hope that their mutual embrace will be creative, will give rise to a child who embodies the oneness they share. Some people hope that more than others. Some people who've had a child or two hope for it less than they previously did, but it's natural to hope. And it's natural that they, and no doubt their parents who would like to be, I suspect would like to be grandparents, should value the human significance of lines of kinship and descent that locate us in the world. And it's not surprising, therefore, it should come as no surprise that, driven by the desire for what they think of as a child of their own, they may consider turning to technologies of assisted reproduction. I mean, that's a very natural impulse. Now, to be sure, an infertile couple could use IVF, use no third-party gametes, no surrogate, implant all the embryos they produced, and refrain from using PGD, prenatal genetic diagnosis, to screen those embryos. Perhaps in such a case, the deeper significance of procreation will not have been lost. Although, I don't know, even that limited use of IVF risks beginning to think of the child not simply as gift, but as product. But that paragraph started with the words perhaps, okay? And perhaps IVF could be used that way. But we should go on to say, to realize how rare such an approach has become in our world, how difficult it will be for a couple who start on this road to set themselves against the momentum and the desires that beginning a process of IVF involves. How hard it may be to resist the pressure to use acquired gametes, to produce additional embryos that are not implanted, to screen those embryos for defects. It can be done, but it will take enormous strength of will to manage to do that. Strength of will most often set over against one's physician, probably. Part of the sadness of life is that we sometimes cannot and at other times ought not do what we deeply desire to do. And if technologies of assisted reproduction often distort the meaning of the presence of children, We should not allow that sort of sense of desperation to tempt us to transform the meaning of procreation into a technical act of reproduction. So although we acknowledge and recognize the sadness of infertility, Christians have good reason, I think, to sort of resist that desire that can become so desperate for a child of one's own. In the first place, we should be clear. I know that not all Christians would say what I'm about to say. Okay, there are various traditions, but we should be clear that Christians have no continuing obligation to have children. It is a mitzvah for Jews, but not for Christians. To be sure, the one flesh union of husband and wife should always turn outward. We don't get married just to stare forever into one another's eyes. The union should turn outward. A child is the way in which that most naturally happens almost without our thinking about it sometimes, but it is not the only way for that turning outward to happen. The divine word, be fruitful and multiply, spoken at the creation, has been reshaped and transformed in the history of redemption. And because the child has been born, as St. Augustine says, because the child has been born, that is the promised child, in whom human life has been created anew, in whom, as St. Paul says, all God's promises have their yes. Because that child has been born, we have no obligation to produce generation after generation of children. Moreover, those who are unmarried or childless, whether that state is deliberately chosen or simply an accident of one's personal history, those people have an important role in the life of the church. In their singleness, they remind us that the wedding feast of the Lamb is something quite different from the restoration of our earthly marriages. And believe me, we need that among Christians. Scratch the nice pious person sitting next to you in the pew next Sunday and ask them what's so good about heaven. Well, they'll be reunited with loved ones, after all. It's good that God will be there too, but it's that reunion with loved ones that is there. What the singleness of some Christians reminds us is that the wedding feast of the Lamb is not that. It's not that restoration of our earthly marriage. That may happen, but that's not what is at the heart of it. And in their childlessness, they remind us that the church grows not because of our natural capacity to give birth, but through the grace of adoption as God's children. So theirs is a special vocation in service to the church. And once again, you can find a lot of articles to read that suggest that the reason that the churches are declining is that Christians aren't having enough babies. Well, there's a sense, no doubt, in which that's true. Adolf von Harnack said that bracketing the work of the Holy Spirit, the reason that explains the rise of the Christian church to prominence in the early centuries was that their birth rate was higher, maybe. But you don't become a member of the church simply by being born even to Christian parents. That's not how that happens. And in fact, the antidote to this sort of desperate search for a child of one's own is given us in baptism. I warned you that this would happen. There we learn to take seriously that, as St. Paul writes, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. There, in baptism, we relinquish any claim to a child of our own and a child over. And having given it up, receive the child back as one before whom we now stand as the representatives and mediators of God's covenant love and care. Therefore, it is neither biology nor genetics that is at the heart of parenthood. Rather, it is a lifelong commitment to be a parent to the child whom God has adopted as his own and now places into our arms. Knowing ourselves to be God's children only by adoption, we weren't born into it, we can rejoice in the truth that whether our children have been given to us through natural birth or through adoption, they are not our possession, but a trust given us by God. Let me finally try to draw these several reflections together in sort of succinct theological form to try to summarize what I think it means to think of God, of a child, as God's gift. And we can think of this within sort of three angles of vision. In the light of our created nature, in the light of the new creation into which we have been adopted, and in the light of the redeemed creation that God promises. If you want to see this worked out in great detail, you need only read all the volumes of Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics, but you might be willing to settle just for these concluding comments of mine, rather than undertaking that task. But first, we are created as embodied creatures, occupying a fixed place within the generations of humankind. Lines of kinship and descent are important. They locate and identify us, and the sexual union of a man and woman is naturally ordered toward the birth of children. Hence, the child, understood in terms of God's creative work, is less a product of our will and choice than a gift God gives, a gift God bestows on the embodied love of a man and a woman. And in this way, God continues to sustain and care for the creation. Nevertheless, second, that natural kinship is always in need of transformation. We can't just rest in it or appeal to it. We need to be shaped in a way of life that does not think of children as our possessions. Therefore, within the church, we draw our children into that new life that we share in Jesus, the crucified and risen one. You know, there was even a period in the history of the church when parents were not allowed to be, in certain areas where presents were not allowed to be present at the baptism of their children. They were really handing them over to the church to receive them back. So within the church, we draw our children into that new life, and in handing the child over for baptism, parents acknowledge that in the most fundamental sense, this child is not their own. I understand that it's an awful lot of work to teach many parents in the church to learn to think that way, but it's a fact nonetheless. The kinship that identifies us is not determined by DNA. It is the life we share in a new community that is Christ's body. And then third and finally, we live toward a day in which the creation redeemed in God and Christ will be fully perfected. Even now, we are given a hint of that day in the Eucharistic meal the church shares. See, I did warn again about high sacramental theology. We're given a hint of that day in the Eucharistic meal. And in that redeemed creation, the creation that is promised, all of us, whatever our genetic relationships, our marital relationships, all of us, husbands and wives, parents and children, will share as brothers and sisters in the great banquet that is the wedding feast of Christ and his church. Thank you.
That was Dr. Gilbert Meilaender on the meaning of children, competing narratives. Please do save the date now for next year's conference, The Future of Health, Faith, Ethics, and Our MedTech World, June 27 through 29, 2024. You've been listening to and watching the Bioethics Podcast, a project of the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity at Trinity International University. Our copyright is 2023 and all rights are reserved. The Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity is a Christian bioethics research center at Trinity International University, exploring the nexus of biomedicine, biotechnology, and our common humanity. Our website, cbhd.org, has a wealth of materials on a wide range of bioethical issues. For more information about the Center and to support the work of the Center and projects like this podcast, please visit our website, cbhd.org. My name is Matthew Epinette, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center. Thank you for listening to and watching the Bioethics Podcast.